So to offer an introduction, please introduce yourself and some background information on your research career. So I'm Dr. Julie Latchem-Hastings. I'm a physiotherapist by background with an interest in neurological care, rehabilitation and long-term care settings, really. I came to Cardiff University to do my Masters in Social Research Methods, really to take a bit of a clinical career break in 2012. And then didn't go back to being a clinician. Instead, I enjoyed the research and the methods so much that I then went forward and did my PhD. And I looked during my PhD at how the futures of people with severe brain injury were being shaped by rehabilitative practice. So that's me and my background. What award do you hold and how long was this awarded? So I have a Health and Care Research Wales Social Care Fellowship, Postdoctoral Fellowship Award. My award was awarded in 2019 and it was originally due to run till 2023. Could you give an outline of the project that you obtained the award for? Yes, so my Social Care Fellowship is called FEAST, which really stands for a very long title of Food, Eating and Drinking in Neurological Care, Sharing Practice to Transform Care, which actually is a really terrible title. So it's just lucky that FEAST just kind of sounds buzzy, because I think you need that you need that in projects for it to sound really interesting. For me, the project is all about really looking at how the role of food and feeding, eating and drinking, I guess supports or impacts the well-being of people with neurological conditions who live in long-term care settings. So these are often younger adults, often aged sort of 18 to 65, who live in long-term care settings that are specially for people with neurological conditions, and they sit outside of NHS services. They're often run by independent companies or charities, and often people aren't aware that this kind of setting exists. So it's quite a big, in terms of research, it's quite a big research gap to be looking at the needs of this particular population. What tends to happen is that how we understand aged care and older people's care homes can get put onto these places. So it's really important that specific research for younger people is looked at, and that's one of the things that my fellowship is offering. It very much connects to my PhD when I looked at people with severe brain injuries in these settings and their rehabilitation, because some of the key observations that I made during my PhD around how important food and eating and how food was used in these places, largely to entertain, to get to know people, almost sometimes to simulate personal choices and character, and to offer some form of choice was really, really powerful. And I desperately wanted to look at that really closely, and my fellowship awards allowed me to do that. So how did you ensure that the project fitted with the remit of the award? Yeah, okay. So for me, that's quite an interesting question, because the year that I applied, my project wasn't one of the priority areas, and to be honest, that did concern me. I can't remember what the priority areas were for my particular year, but the sort of focus of younger care, younger people, for me didn't actually fit with any of the priorities. I was, however, encouraged to apply nonetheless, and that and reassured that you didn't have to necessarily fit with priority areas. However, in terms of thinking about the remit, I think I just focused on really making sure that I explained that my area fit within social care, because it's a setting that people aren't familiar with. And for me, the people that I'm researching also have a lot of health needs. I really did have to focus on really making sure that the panel understood it was a social care setting, and what that setting was, just to really, I guess, really ground it in the social care area. Other than that, I can't remember focusing too much on remit other than making sure that I myself fit all the criteria, and that I had fully engaged with what the application form was asking me in each area, and that I was really meeting what was being asked of me in each question. So how did you go about gaining the necessary support from your organisation? Okay, so for me, I guess I was lucky in that I, at that point, held a role within a Centre for Trials research unit, and I had people around me who are constantly writing research grants all the time, and I had both my line manager and my mentor at that point was a director of the centre, and so therefore the gaining support from the organisation began with a conversation from her, and a direction really from her of who I needed to talk to quite early on. In our case, it was really just making sure that I had agreement from the head of our centre, and that I had started to talk to the right pre-awards people within the university. Who supported you with the application? Okay, so for me, there's probably quite a long list of people who supported me with my application. At the time, I had a very experienced line manager and mentor. She was also acting as a mentor for me, really, who was excellent in helping me articulate and I guess challenge and question how I was articulating, putting my research ideas across. I had great support internally within the university to help me cost my application and understand the costing process. And I had a broader network of colleagues who were willing to listen to me talk about my ideas and my application, and who later on in the process were willing to listen to me present and give feedback on my presentation before I moved forward. I'd also say my wife was a great support to me during the application process. I think you need somebody who will listen to your frustrations at times, and maybe pick you up when you're lacking a little bit of energy and you need to press on. They're not long applications, but because you're doing it independently, you have to do everything yourself. You don't have, co-applicants working on things alongside you for these. This is all really on you, and you're learning probably both the process of putting together your sort of first big independent application, and then you're learning the process of doing the application all at the same time. So there's quite a lot to think about. What was the application process like, and how long did it take? I'm pretty sure that for me, I knew that the grant call was due, based just on recognizing the cycle of when these applications come out, and I had long started thinking about the bare bones of my project and what I really wanted to look at. So I had done some background work thinking about my research idea. I think overall I was surprised, even once I got hold of the actual application form and could start filling it in, I was surprised at how long all the other things around it. So not only articulating your research idea, making sure it's evidence, making sure all of that's clear, but all the things outside of that, all the other questions, around governance and management, ethics, public involvement and engagement questions, questions about your own organisation that you might not necessarily know the answer to. All those things, all those peripheral things, probably took me as much time as it did to actually write, the research component. So I think awareness of not trying to do this last minute would definitely be something I would say about that. In terms of the process itself, I mean, really, it's a great way of learning grant application processes. You have to learn step by step on how you go through things, both internally with your organisation, how you're filling in forms, who you're requesting things from, and that's not really any different to any other grant. So it's a really important learning process. And in terms of overall how long it I must have been working on this 6 to 8 months as an overall process, with it being more intense at the end, obviously, in terms of the organisational process component of it. So what did you find the hardest part of the application? So in terms of the actual application form, I think the hardest thing for me was maybe mapping my research against policy. Most of my research ideas come from grounded experiences or things that have emerged out of other projects and data. They're not necessarily policy led. And traditionally, me sitting in, say, a social policy arena wouldn't be where I've come from. So I'm not hugely aware of policy unless I really go looking for it. So I always have to sort of map across and specifically go and find things and read and update. And I think that probably took me a bit longer than I anticipated. I think inevitably you find the right policy connection, but you have to do some work around that. It doesn't just jump out at you. So I think being aware that can take a long period of time. And again, also some of those peripheral questions about governance and management and your own organisation, you really need to leave time to make sure that you can get answers to those questions, because they're probably just not necessarily things you know in your day-to-day work. If you work within the organisation or if you're partnering with it, you definitely won't know the answers to those questions because you're not party to that information. You have to make sure that you're asking specifically about it. So following the submission of the application, how did you find the rest of the process, including the interviews? Okay. Yeah, so I can remember feeling overjoyed when I knew that I had got through the first part of the submission process once I had submitted my main application, and then immediately super nervous that then I was going to have to go through an interview process. So I guess I'm going to tell you a secret here. Once I knew I had to do an interview, I started really, again, preparing for that almost immediately. I went through a great process where I had some fantastic colleagues who really grilled me. I presented and they really grilled me, and they looked really closely at my slides. I thought they were looking kind of pretty reasonable at that point, and they tore them apart really, and made me kind of redo them to make them really, really specific. Once I'd practiced, once I delivered it, got that feedback from colleagues and redone it and kept practicing. The best bit of advice that then came to me was from my wife, who said, I think you need to try and practice your presentation as part of your interview in the actual location that you're going to do the interview. So as soon as we found out where the interview was being held, obviously this was a face-to-face situation, and maybe it won't be like that moving forwards, but if it is face-to-face, we then went to the location of the interview, which happened to be a hotel. We found out the room that the interview was going to be in, and we physically, the day before, went into that room and practiced the presentation in situ. What I learned from doing that was that the room was going to be set up in a certain way, and the way in which the room was set up shows me how many people were likely to be there. And the one thing I hadn't been told really was that there were quite a lot on the panel. And I think had I gone in to that interview not realizing quite how many people were going to be on the panel, I would have been really overwhelmed, and that would have been really unhelpful. So on the presumption that panels are going to be a similar size now for you as they were for me, then you could be looking at sort of 10 people, maybe even 12, who are interviewing you and who are on that panel in the room. So you have to be prepared for quite a big audience. So how do you find reporting on progress of the project? Yeah, so for me, I actually quite enjoy the reporting component, because you have to ask yourself those key questions. Where am I at? What have I achieved? did I achieve what I said I was going to achieve in the last quarter, and what do I want to achieve in the next quarter? So I don't find them laborious at all. I find it really straightforward, and actually a really helpful part of just trying to keep myself on track through the project. Any tips for submitting an application? So I think my tips for the application process are to make sure that you're communicating your research idea really clearly in the form, that you're not really leaving anything to doubt, and that you've nailed all the basics. You don't want to be giving reviewers any reason for just dismissing your application because of lack of clarity or because the methods aren't solid, you know, any of those things that you are really in control of. I think that would be my first tip. My second tip, I think, would be you need something that is going to help you stand out just a tiny bit. It doesn't have to be completely earth-shattering, but just some added interest, something that might just spark the imagination of the panel. In years where everybody's great, then there needs to be something a little bit more interesting about the project that might just pop you above somebody else and help maybe your project to stick in the minds of reviewers. In terms of other tips, basically, if there is a box on the application, there's an expectation that something's going to be done around it and it's going to be answered. So really make sure that you're incredibly thorough with answering all questions that are put to you in the application form. There are particular areas of the application form which take a long time and which you probably need some support from other people for. So I've made some notes here. So, for example, there's one section about long-term career development that's in the form. And I personally think to answer that well, you need to talk to someone with some experience. So having a mentor to talk to you about, I guess, how trajectories get built, research trajectories get built, and how you might piece things together is really, really useful, and really drawing on their experience. I suppose if you don't have a mentor, this is a perfect opportunity to find one, and trying to get a mentor as early as possible in the process is really key. And it may be that you're really lucky, like I was, that you had someone who was both line manager and mentor at the same time. But if you don't, then reach out to people who have a strong research career, someone that maybe you particularly respect, and ask them for their guidance as early, as literally as soon as you've identified that you want to apply for whatever your grant award is. There's questions often in these forms around research environment, and for example, in the social care fellowship, there's a question around your host department's track record, critical mass and capacity. Now, if you're anything like me at that point, I didn't even know what that meant, let alone being able to answer it. So you need to be talking to your organisation quite early on, again, to have answers to those sorts of questions that you just simply might not know anything about. And I guess my last tip for the application form is there will be a public involvement and engagement box. And although currently it says if members of the public were actively involved in identifying the research topic, preparing this application, or if active involvement is planned to give details, that's, in my opinion, not really an invitation for you to say, non-applicable, haven't done any. It's an opportunity for you to take really seriously public involvement and engagement, and to have done some work around that, ensuring people have been involved in whichever way is suitable for your research, and ensuring that you do have a continual plan for public engagement through your work. Yeah, for me, although there's the word if, it's not really an if, it's a how.